Preach the gospel always. The words of St. Francis that we ended with last week. When necessary, use words. Preach the gospel always. When necessary, use words. Words can get us in trouble, can't they? It was to my great horror that I noticed that our worship theme for May was joy, as I made the decision and announced the decision that Emily and I would be leaving. And yet, Elaine Duval mentioned in a board meeting, it can't just be sad the rest of the time you're here. We need some joy too. So we'll be weaving that joy and sorrow woven fine, clothing for the soul divine, as William Blake had it this month. Another word that gets us into trouble, it's the word we'll talk about later, it's evangelize. I'm going to attempt today to convince you all to be Unitarian Universalist evangelists. It's one of those things you can do when you're leaving. Christopher Wolf, Ariel's, who happens to be Ariel's partner, he's also the ministerial intern in Victoria. Chris Wolf was having a conversation one day with another colleague, Michael Tino, and they were talking, I don't know how it came up, but they were talking about whether, Chris would talk about Unitarian Universalism and his involvement. He's a lifelong UU, his involvement, his church activities in public, and on Facebook in particular. I think that was what they were talking about. And he said, no, I would never do that. That's just not, I don't really talk about it. It's not something you talk about publicly, And Michael Tino turned to him and said, so it's your fault. He said, so it's your fault that as a gay man, I never heard about a tradition that said there was a God that loves me exactly as I am until I was 30 years old. It's your fault. And Chris shared that story at a meeting recently and said that since then I've shared a bit more, and I have become a Unitarian Universalist evangelist. And we'll get into it a little bit more later, but I do think that we come to church because we have good news. We have something worth celebrating, worth being joyful about here. Boston, Massachusetts, January 27th, 1825. Was the very first official meeting held to consider forming the American Unitarian Association, what would become the Unitarian Universalist Association, give rise to the Canadian Unitarian Council. After the preliminary remarks, the declaration of the intention of the meeting was made. The very first recorded comments in the meeting were these, made by Reverend Dr. Bancroft of Worcester, Massachusetts. He said, I am fearful that we take sufficient care in the manner of instituting these meetings so proposed. That's a good Unitarian opening. I feel that Unitarianism, this is the important part, I feel that Unitarianism should be propagated slowly and silently. It has always been so from the beginning with the progress of Unitarianism in this country. Unitarianism should be propagated slowly and silently. I don't know about you, but I hear an implied, if at all. And of course, Reverend Dr. Bancroft was neither the first nor the last to advocate this approach to sharing the good news of our tradition. So it's not really Chris's fault. Michael Tino has Reverend Dr. Bancroft to blame, all of us who've stifled sharing the tremendous value of what we do here. And so to evangelize, you might know this from the Greek, literally means to announce good news. In the middle there, the angel, the messenger of good news. And of course, for many who use that word regularly, the good news is Jesus and the atonement theology of his death for humanity's sins. But just because that's not our good news doesn't mean we don't have good news to share, does it? Jim Stevenson, I remember joking in one of his sermons that he's given here, you just have to wait for Unitarians to start talking about the last great movie that they saw, or the book that they've read, or restaurant, especially the restaurant they've eaten at, and you'll hear how evangelical we can be. Forrest Church, who served our All Souls congregation in New York City until his death in 2009, was regarded by many as really the greatest theologian, maybe universalist theologian of his time, of his generation. That piece that the choir just sang, Many Windows, One Light, it's an image from his theological opus, The Cathedral of the World. He first introduced the image in a sermon, and this is how he started. He said, imagine yourself at a dinner party. The only person there who goes to church. Anybody can relate to this experience? When this telling bit of information about you somehow inadvertently leaks out, you pique the curiosity of your companions, all of whom graduated from organized religion years ago. They want to know why. They want to know more. All of a sudden, the dinner party is in jeopardy. Feeling more defensive than evangelical, you start pushing spin control buttons. Well, not really church. You see, I'm a Unitarian Universalist. Oh, I've always wondered about Unitarians. What do they believe? One of your dinner mates asks. Actually, nothing, you sputter. Well, not really nothing. More like anything. Sensing from the half-amused, half-bewildered expressions of your companions that more of an explanation than this might prove necessary before they will let you change the subject, and worried lest anyone conclude that you harbor any silly or childish superstitions, you rush to assure them that you don't believe that Jesus was born of a virgin or resurrected on the third day. You almost never read the Bible. And you certainly agree that religion is a dangerous force in the world, especially today. He gave this sermon a year after September 11th, 2001. To which your friends gently and proudly proclaim that these are the very reasons that they do not attend church. One of the most significant sermons that I ever heard was given by a progressive Christian to a gathered assembly of about 500 Unitarian ministers. Kay Northcutt was her name, and she described one morning standing at the bathroom sink, brushing her teeth in her pink fuzzy bathrobe. That really stuck out to me for some reason. Her pink fuzzy bathrobe, wondering what she needed to say to the Unitarians. And just in that moment, there was a knock on the door, and she went and answered it in her pink fuzzy bathrobe, and there was a Jehovah's Witness standing right there at the door, ready to share the good news. And at that particular conflagration of moments, it led her to ask, with something like holy indignation, why has a Unitarian Universalist never knocked on my door? This tradition, she said, saves lives. This faith that brings a message of unconditional love and hope for this life to those who thought they were outside the circle of any organized religion. Why haven't you ever come knocking on my door? She asked us. So I thought of that as I read Forrest Church's next line. Do you know what happens when you cross a Unitarian and a Jehovah's Witness? Someone who knocks on your door for no apparent reason. But then he gets to the heart of it. Let me tell you something, he says. I am an evangelical Unitarian Universalist. For me, evangelical Unitarian Universalism is not an oxymoron. When I ask people to unlock the doors shuttering their minds, I do so for a reason. And he said, this morning I'll share that reason with you, not only for those of you who are new to our faith, but also for all who find it easier to explain what they don't believe than what they do. I bring you our good news. First, we believe in miracles. Not in the stopping of the sun, not at the parting of the Red Sea, but the miracle of the sun shining upon the earth, and the miracle of oceans teeming with life, the miracle of a newborn child, the miracle of consciousness, the miracle of hope, the miracle of fluttering leaves, felt tears, open hearts. Fundamentalist and Orthodox believers find their miracles in Scripture. Skeptics and materialists discount the very idea of miracles. Unitarian Universalists follow Ralph Waldo Emerson and say all life is a miracle, from the blowing clover to the falling rain. But as that imagined conversation of the dinner party meanders back and forth, he says you may need to share a bit more. You may need to share about the cathedral of the world. This cathedral, it's as ancient as humankind. Its cornerstone, the first altar, marked with the tincture of blood and stained with tears. Search for a lifetime, which is all you are surely given, and you shall not know its limits. Visit all its transepts, worship at its myriad shrines, nor span its celestial ceiling with your gaze. The builders have worked from time immemorial, destroying and creating, confounding and perfecting, tearing down and raising up arches in this cathedral, buttresses and chapels, organs and theaters, chancels and transepts, gargoyles, idols and icons. Not a moment passes without work begun that shall not be finished in the lifetime of the architects who planned it, the patrons who paid for it, the builders who construct it, or the expectant worshipers. Throughout human history, one generation after another has labored lovingly, sometimes fearfully, crafting memorials and consecrating shrines. Untold numbers of these collect dust in long, undisturbed chambers. Others, cast centuries or eons ago from their once respected places, lie shattered in shards or ground into powder on the cathedral floor. Not a moment passes without the dreams of long-dead dreamers being outstripped, shattered, or abandoned, giving way to new visions, each immortal in reach, ephemeral in grasp. Welcome to the cathedral of the world. Above all else, Forest Church instructs, contemplate the windows. In the cathedral of the world, there are windows without number. Some long forgotten, covered with many patinas of grime, others revered by millions, the most sacred of shrines, each in its own way beautiful. Some are abstract, others representational, some dark and meditative, others bright and dazzling. Each window tells a story about the creation of the world, the meaning of history, the purpose of life, the nature of humankind, the mystery of death. The windows of the cathedral are where the light shines through. This metaphor is a perfect description of Unitarian Universalism. One light, Unitarianism, one light shines through many windows, Universalism, illuminating human minds and hearts in many different ways. In our congregations, we honor this truth by encouraging our members to reflect on the light through whatever set of windows they find most illuminating. You get to choose your own windows. We only require that the same freedom be honored for others. 2 years ago, when we first showed up here and accepted the call to be your ministers, the greatest angst and pain that I heard in the community over and over again was about theological language. Atheists and humanists worried about too much prayer and God talk entering services, making them feel excluded. Theists and mystics worried about services staying at the level of the intellect, making them feel excluded. It was that angst that I heard from you that prompted me to offer that series of Wounded Words conversations this year. Conversations about what I called the minefield of religious vocabulary. Words that have been wounded in some way or another that carry cultural baggage. Words like prayer, worship, God, sin and salvation, even church or religion. What's been amazing to me about these conversations is that with every single word that we've talked about, every one, there have been members of our community who feel very strongly about it on both sides. Those who cannot stand to be in a room where a prayer is uttered, and those who try to live every moment as a prayer. Those for whom God is a way of naming their most profound experiences of meaning and love. Those for whom God is the most oppressive concept that they can imagine. In most of our conversations, I prefaced like this. I said, my goal with the dialogues, it's not to convince anyone to change their mind about anything. Not to convince anyone to change how they like or dislike any word. But it was my goal to encourage us to hear the words through one another's ears. To embrace the complex reality that these words really do mean different things to different people. And we want to find just the right word to use. And if that's not possible, we at least want the list of the right words to not use. Right? The banned words that would just fix the problem. But the complex postmodern truth is that most of the time we're not going to have just the right word. And banning words will actually lead us away from the inclusive, pluralistic community we desire. Instead, we must remember we're in the cathedral of the world. When we were in Rochester, New York, my friend Katie Jo Sotheby was a Baptist minister. She preached at the annual Interfaith Thanksgiving service, the longest-running service of its kind. She shared a bit of her spiritual journey from her youth as a fundamentalist to becoming an American Baptist minister. She would always assure, not the scary kind of Baptist. And she said, I'm a liberal, but not because I have no standards, but because I've learned about compersion. You know about this word, compersion? Compersion is witnessing someone else's pleasure and enjoying it. Not in a creepy way, she said. She said it's the opposite of aversion. She referenced when I walked down the hall of my middle school being the makeout police. That was a sign of my aversion. The opposite of that is that moment in the wedding, the kiss, when the officiant says you may kiss the bride or you may kiss one another, and everyone in the audience leans in and is silent. And for those seconds, everyone in the room is enjoying the show of love between the couple. That's compersion. Compersion, the experience of enjoying someone else's pleasure. You know, there's that old joke about why Unitarians have a hard time singing hymns in parts especially. Allison's been doing good work with us, but it's an uphill battle. It's because we're too busy looking ahead to see whether or not we agree with the words. And I know that there are some of you who cringe every time that G word pops up in a hymn, every time there's a whiff of prayer in the service. Or it might be even less theological, just that piece of contemporary music, jazz in church, feels so out of place. Or you can't stand to hear one more classical choral arrangement by a dead white guy. There's countless opportunities to be irritated at church. So here's an alternative. Practice compersion. Anytime something happens at church that you don't enjoy is an opportunity to remember that it is feeding someone else here. That another member of your community, someone you probably love and care about, but at the very least have covenanted to belong, thrive, and serve with. Another member of your community is being nourished by the very thing making you uncomfortable. So practice enjoying their pleasure. Be nourished by their being nourished. For we worship here in the cathedral of the world, celebrating many windows and the one light of our inescapable interdependence. And if I can be so bold, let me say it like this. Before I do, I'll say the best compliment I ever received after a sermon was in a tough moment in a community, a really tough moment. And somebody told me afterward, an elder said, "You're going to be a great parent to teenagers." I don't think I've preached a sermon like that here. So I'm just letting you know, little warning for this line. If I can be so bold, let me say it like this. Don't you dare start fighting over this again. Don't you dare, after I've left, start fighting over this again. Your people need you too much for that. Your city needs you too much for that. Your world needs you too much for that. You are Unitarians and you've inherited the sacred calling to proclaim the truth of our tradition. We need not think alike to love alike. The poet and prophet Audre Lorde said it like this: it's not our differences that divide us. It's not. It's our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. Celebrate our differences. This is the holy promise of our faith. This is the great quest our spiritual ancestors have laid before us and which we have the privilege of carrying on, because inclusive community, beloved community, is not about making sure I feel comfortable and don't get my buttons pushed. Beloved community is about making sure there's room for another to come sit next to me, even if they make me a bit uncomfortable. Especially if they make me a bit uncomfortable. Beloved community is about the awesome grace, the unlikely blessing of being part of a religious tradition, a spiritual community, or that thing I do on Sunday morning with such a big tent that we don't even agree on the words to describe it. That's the blessing. It's not easy, but it's what the world needs. You are lucky enough to have found one of the mere handful of communities in the world where atheists and theists, crazy New Agey mystics, and hard-nosed, tough-minded rationalists gather and break bread together in the same humble cathedral and call themselves one people. Ain't that good news? Ain't that the very good news that a confused and broken world, a people torn apart by religious shame and violence in the name of God, ain't that just the good news that needs to be spread? And who is going to proclaim it if not you? Maybe so. Amen. I love you.